On March 15, 1862, the Boston Medical Society received a strange package wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a pale young man lying in a coffin, his eyes closed and hands folded across his chest in the traditional Victorian style of death portraits. At first, nothing about the image seemed unusual until Dr. Samuel Hayes noticed faint markings on the silver surface. Tiny scratches that looked disturbingly like fingernail marks, as if someone had clawed at the picture from the inside. A note accompanied the photograph stating simply, "Thomas Copeland died, February 28, 1861, Millbrook, Massachusetts. May God forgive what I have done." It was signed by Dr. Frederick Copeland, a respected physician who had mysteriously vanished 6 months earlier, after whispers of questionable experiments and the suspicious death of his younger brother. The story of the Copeland brothers remained hidden for over a century, sealed away in the archives of the Medical Society until a renovation in 1963 uncovered a secret compartment filled with Frederick's medical journals, letters, and most chilling of all, a series of similar photographs marked with the same claw-like scratches. Back in 1861, Millbrook was a small New England town 30 miles west of Boston, balancing rural traditions with the growth of textile mills powered by the rushing Millbrook River. Its 800 residents lived in white clapboard houses with black shutters, while the shadow of the Civil War loomed over families, sending their sons to uncertain fates in battle. Into this setting came Dr. Frederick Copeland in 1859, a tall, intense man of 32 with Harvard training and a reputation for sharp intelligence. The town welcomed him eagerly, especially after their previous doctor had died suddenly, leaving them without medical care. Frederick was not alone. He brought his younger brother Thomas, a kind-hearted man of 26, who struggled with severe epileptic seizures. Despite the stigma of the time, Frederick's devotion to Thomas was well known. Together they lived in a large colonial home on Elm Street, where Frederick ran his practice from the second floor, while Thomas tended patients' records and kept a thriving medicinal garden. Townsfolk admired Thomas for his gentle nature and knowledge of plants, yet they could not ignore how his health steadily worsened. As his seizures grew more violent and prolonged, Frederick's demeanor began to change as well. Though his practice thrived, those closest to him began noticing a darker, unsettling shift in his behavior. By the winter of 1860, Thomas's seizures had become relentless, sometimes striking several times in a single day. The usual remedies of the era, bloodletting, purging, and crude medications, proved useless, leaving Frederick frustrated and desperate. His journals from that period show how his determination to help his brother pushed him onto a darker path, one he would later call necessary experimentation. He began corresponding with European physicians, studying ancient herbal texts, and following the controversial work of Dr. Claude Bernard in Paris, who was experimenting with plant alkaloids and their effects on the nervous system. Frederick became convinced that if certain compounds could paralyze muscles or induce unconsciousness, they might also be able to quiet the electrical storms in Thomas's brain. The basement of the Copeland home soon became an improvised laboratory lit by rows of oil lamps and cluttered with glassware scales and tinctures. At first, Frederick worked cautiously, testing mild extracts from plants like willow bark for pain relief, foxglove for heart conditions, and calming herbs. He practiced first on lab mice brought from a Boston colleague, carefully recording doses and results. Thomas, fully aware of his brother's work, volunteered to take part in these trials. His suffering was so great that he welcomed the risks if it meant a chance at relief. At first, Frederick's notes revealed discipline and precision. He tracked outcomes meticulously, noting that certain mixtures seemed to reduce seizure frequency. But the balance was fragile. Too much of a compound could turn medicine into poison. As the snow deepened that winter, Frederick's patience began to fray. His entries became more erratic as he reached for stronger substances, belladonna, which could cause hallucinations and heart problems, and aconite, a toxin so potent that even trace amounts could kill. He convinced himself that Thomas's worsening condition justified any danger, even as neighbors began noticing changes in the once friendly doctor. He grew pale, withdrawn, and unsteady, with trembling hands and dark circles under his eyes, while locking himself away for endless hours in the basement. By February 27, 1861, the situation reached its breaking point. That morning, Thomas endured one of his worst seizures, yet leaving him weak and confused. Frederick, exhausted and consumed by obsession, decided to abandon caution. He turned to a new compound he had been perfecting for months, a volatile blend of toxic plant extracts and a rare fungus that grew on rye grain, known for causing convulsions, madness, and death when consumed in spoiled bread. Frederick believed the alkaloids it contained might interrupt seizure activity. That night, as Thomas convulsed violently again, Frederick abandoned his measured test dose and instead administered nearly triple the amount, convinced a stronger treatment would finally bring salvation. The result was immediate and horrifying. The seizure stopped, but Thomas's body stiffened, his skin drained of color, and his pulse slowed to a faint flicker. His pupils froze wide and unresponsive. Panicked Frederick fought through the night to save his brother, trying every measure at his disposal. He poured stimulants down Thomas's throat, applied heated compresses, and even resorted to the crude practice of electrical shocks with a galvanic device. Nothing worked. By dawn, Thomas lay cold and still. His life extinguished, not by his illness, but by the cure his brother had desperately and fatally pursued. As the morning of February 28th dawned, Thomas showed no sign of life. His body cold and unresponsive despite Frederick's desperate efforts through the night. The reality that his brother was gone and that his own hand had caused it pressed down with crushing weight. Terrified of scandal and unable to face the legal and moral consequences of his reckless experiment, Frederick chose deception. He would present Thomas's death as a tragic but natural result of his long struggle with epilepsy, a condition well known to the townsfolk and often fatal during violent seizures. Frederick set about preparing the body, calling on all of his medical knowledge to disguise the truth. The toxic compounds had left Thomas's skin unnaturally pale, almost waxen, and his limbs stiff in a way that did not quite resemble the ordinary stages of rigor mortis. Frederick worked meticulously, applying cosmetics to bring back some color and repositioning the limbs until they appeared more natural. The greater challenge lay in controlling what others might see. In a small town like Millbrook, a death was never private. Neighbors, friends, even casual acquaintances came to the house to offer comfort. Frederick solved this by insisting that Thomas's final seizure had left his body in such a disturbing state that a closed casket was the most merciful choice. His explanation fit with what everyone already knew. Many had witnessed Thomas collapse in violent convulsions, and the idea that one attack had finally claimed his life felt both believable and heartbreakingly inevitable. If anything raised eyebrows, it was Frederick's refusal of help with the funeral preparations and his insistence on managing everything himself. He explained away concerns with plausible talk of hygiene and warm weather, citing the need for a swift burial to avoid health risks. His clinical authority silenced doubts. On March 2nd, a simple pine coffin was carried to the quiet corner of the town cemetery where Thomas was laid to rest. Nearly half the town attended, their presence a testament to the young man's quiet kindness and gentle reputation. Frederick stood at the graveside, outwardly calm and dignified, inwardly consumed with guilt and fear. His short eulogy praising Thomas's bravery in the face of illness and his compassion toward others moved many to tears. To them, Frederick's composure was a display of quiet strength, when in truth it was the brittle mask of a man on the edge of collapse. It was Reverend Isaiah Hartwell, who suggested the family commission a post-mortem photograph. Photography was still costly in 1861, and many families had no portrait of their loved ones until death made it a final necessity. Frederick balked at the idea, terrified that the camera's unblinking lens might capture some detail that would betray his secret. But the Reverend's gentle encouragement, paired with community expectation, left him little room to refuse. A traveling photographer, Samuel Morrison, known throughout Massachusetts and Vermont for his dignified portraits of the dead, arrived the next morning. He moved with the quiet confidence of experience, arranging Thomas's body, adjusting the light, and creating the illusion of peaceful rest. Frederick stood nearby, his anxiety so intense he could scarcely breathe, watching every movement, praying that nothing in the finished image would expose the terrible truth. Morrison worked with quiet precision, arranging Thomas's body in the coffin, folding his hands neatly across his chest, and positioning the lamps so that the pallor of his skin appeared softened by the light. He remarked to Frederick that the young man looked unusually serene, as though death had come gently after so many years of suffering. The exposure process dragged on for nearly an hour, requiring complete stillness. Frederick stood close by, staring intently at his brother's face, desperate for the smallest flicker of breath or movement. Deep inside, he feared Thomas might not be entirely gone, that the compounds had simply trapped him in some twilight state between life and death. Yet the silence held unbroken until Frederick began to convince himself that perhaps the drugs had only eased his brother's final passage. When the session ended, Morrison packed his bulky equipment, promising to develop the daguerreotype in his Boston studio and return the finished portrait within the week. The image, he assured, would serve as a lasting memorial, a token of peace after a life of hardship. Frederick pressed payment into his hand and watched as the photographer's carriage rolled out of Millbrook, carrying with it the fragile plates that now held his brother's likeness. Relief and dread churned together in his chest. The photograph would support the illusion of a natural death. Yet it also bound his deception into an image that could never fade. The following afternoon, nearly the whole town gathered for Thomas's burial. Reverend Hartwell spoke solemnly about suffering mortality and the promise of eternal rest. As the first clumps of earth struck the lid of the coffin, Frederick closed his eyes, forcing himself to believe he was only burying a shell, that Thomas's soul had already moved beyond reach. But the sound of the soil landing on the wood echoed in his mind long after the mourners departed. In the weeks that followed, Frederick tried to return to his practice, but every task was shadowed by guilt. Patients noticed his distracted air, the way he lost his train of thought mid-sentence. At night he dosed himself with laudanum, but still woke in terror, dreaming of Thomas clawing at the coffin lid, his muffled cries rising from the ground. 3 weeks later, on March 21st, the awaited daguerreotype arrived by mail coach, along with the usual deliveries from Boston. Morrison had produced a striking image. Thomas posed in perfect stillness, framed with spring flowers, the very picture of gentle repose. To any other eye, it was a touching memorial. To Frederick, it was a mirror of his crime, a silent witness that seemed to stare back at him with accusation. Frederick held the daguerreotype in his trembling hands, staring at the image of his brother. At first it seemed peaceful, almost reassuring, as if Thomas were only sleeping. But when his eyes drifted to the edges of Thomas's fingers, something peculiar caught his attention. Tiny, faint scratches, barely visible, but impossible to ignore once noticed. At first he told himself they must be flaws in the image, tricks of light or shadows from Morrison's lamp. Yet the longer he studied them, the less he could deny their reality. Under a magnifying glass and the glow of a strong lamp, the truth became clear. The marks weren't artifacts. They were scratches in the wood of the coffin, etched where Thomas's hands rested. Worse still, the satin lining near his head bore signs of tearing, as if clawed at from within. A dreadful possibility formed in Frederick's mind. What if Thomas had not been dead when he sealed the coffin? What if the compounds had only induced a death-like trance, leaving his brother alive but trapped beneath the earth? The thought was unbearable. If true, Frederick had not only killed his brother with his reckless experiments, but condemned him to suffer his final moments in suffocating terror. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Thomas in the coffin, clawing, struggling silently, begging for release. By morning, the torment had grown so consuming that Frederick resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He would exhume the body in secret and see with his own eyes what had become of Thomas. On the night of March 23rd, 1861, with the town shrouded in silence, beneath a sky of thick, low clouds, Frederick slipped from his home, carrying a shovel, a crowbar, and a lantern with its flame shuttered. The cemetery lay on a hillside overlooking Millbrook, its rows of weathered stones stretching back generations. Thomas's grave, freshly dug only 3 weeks earlier, was in the newer section shaded by old oaks that cloaked the area in darkness. The digging was grueling. Though the soil was still soft, weeks of rain and settling had packed it down. Weakened by sleepless nights and gnawed by guilt, Frederick labored for nearly 3 hours, pausing often to listen for any sound that might betray him. The night remained deathly still, broken only by the scrape of his shovel and his ragged breathing. When at last his spade struck wood, the hollow sound seemed deafening in the silence. With his bare hands, he scraped the last of the dirt from the coffin, the pine already damp and soft from the earth. He wedged the crowbar beneath the lid and pried it open. The lantern's light revealed what he had both dreaded and expected. Thomas no longer lay serenely as he had on the day of the funeral. His arms were raised, fingers twisted into claws pressed against the lid. The satin lining was shredded, torn to ribbons by frantic hands. His fingernails were cracked and bloodied with tiny splinters of pine embedded beneath them. The evidence was undeniable. Thomas had awakened in the grave. Frederick froze as the lantern light revealed not just claw marks, but words carved into the pine coffin. At first, most of the scratches looked like frantic gouges with no meaning. But then, clear enough to chill his blood, he made out 2 words: Fred, help. His brother had called out to him, even as he suffocated in the dark earth. The sight drove Frederick into a state of horror, deeper than anything he had yet endured. It wasn't a single reckless dose that had killed Thomas. It was the slow cruelty of burying him alive, condemning him to die, clawing at wood and soil, terrified and alone. The following days became a waking nightmare. Frederick could not eat, could not sleep, and could not look his patients in the eye without feeling as though they somehow knew what he had done. His medical practice faltered not only because of his guilt, but because of a paranoia that gnawed at him constantly. He feared that neighbors might recall some detail, some hesitation in his words, and begin to suspect the truth. Alone with his thoughts, he began poring through his journals and treatment notes, desperate to understand how his dedication as a physician had transformed into such monstrous negligence. What he found only deepened his torment. In the yellowed pages of his records, Frederick discovered patterns he had not seen or had refused to see before. Patients he had buried months earlier, people whose deaths he had confidently explained as natural or unavoidable, suddenly took on a new horrifying light. The first name that struck him was Martha Henley, an elderly woman he had treated for nervous disorders the autumn before Thomas's death. He had used extracts similar to those later given to his brother. She had died in her sleep, her death written off as heart failure. Yet in his notes, Frederick had described the same signs: rigid limbs, shallow pulse, a body that seemed dead, though perhaps was not. As he read on, more cases surfaced. James Whitfield, a farmer injured in a fall, had complained of blinding headaches. Frederick had dosed him with tinctures meant to ease the pain, only for him to die suddenly. Days later, young Sarah Mills, just 16, had been brought by her desperate parents after suffering seizures that townsfolk whispered were signs of possession. She died 3 weeks into treatment, her fragile constitution blamed for her passing. Now Frederick recognized the truth. Her symptoms mirrored Thomas's too closely to ignore. The most haunting of all was Timothy Watson, a returned soldier suffering from what was called soldier's heart, a nervous affliction born of the battlefield. Frederick had tried to calm him with plant-based compounds. Timothy's sudden collapse had been explained away as weakness from the war. But Frederick's records now told a darker story. His pulse had slowed, his breathing had thinned, and his body had grown cold. Signs Frederick now feared were not of death, but of a coma like the one that had ensnared Thomas. By the time he put the journals away, Frederick understood the truth that shattered what little remained of his sanity. Thomas had not been his only victim. He had buried others alive, their deaths hidden behind the very trust they had placed in him. The scratches in the coffin were only the beginning. The true horror lay in the realization that his brother's fate was part of a pattern, a trail of suffering and silence stretching back through his months in Millbrook. Timothy Watson's decline had already weighed heavily on Frederick. The soldier's sleepless nights, sudden rages, and long spells of despair seemed at first to ease under Frederick's experimental treatments. But his sudden death, attributed to the lingering effects of war, now appeared in a different light. Reviewing his notes, Frederick realized with horror that Timothy's symptoms in his final hours mirrored those of Thomas' shallow breathing, rigid limbs, and the false stillness of what might have been a drug-induced coma rather than true death. That revelation cracked open a door Frederick could never close. If Thomas had not been his only victim, then others, Martha Henley, James Whitfield, Sarah Mills, Timothy Watson, might all have shared the same fate, buried alive under the guise of natural causes. This thought became the seed of madness. Frederick's guilt metastasized into terror, and terror into a mind unraveling. He began suffering nightmares, as vivid as any battlefield memory, hearing the muffled scratching of nails on wood, waking drenched in sweat to visions of his patients clawing their way back from the grave. His paranoia infected his waking hours too. In his journals, he described feeling watched, judged, condemned by every glance on Millbrook streets. The smallest conversation left him rattled. When neighbors asked polite questions, he heard accusations. When children played near the cemetery, he became convinced they would discover the disturbed soil of Thomas's grave. Even Reverend Hartwell's kindly inquiries felt like veiled threats. His medical practice collapsed under the strain. Patients complained of his distracted stares, his abrupt questions about funerals and burial customs, and his obsessive hand-washing until his skin was raw. To many, he looked simply exhausted, but to Frederick, every moment of contact carried the weight of potential murder. The breaking point came in June, when Dr. Samuel Hayes of the Boston Medical Society visited Millbrook. Hayes had come with good intentions, eager to discuss Frederick's application for membership and his promising research into plant alkaloids. Instead, the visit unspooled into disaster. Hayes's innocent questions about Frederick's experiments triggered a frantic outburst. Frederick denied ever using human subjects, his defensiveness so sharp it startled his guest. When Hayes pressed him for details about his published work, Frederick abruptly ended the meeting and all but shoved him out the door. That night alone in his study, Frederick accepted what he could no longer outrun: the truth of Thomas's death, the likely suffering of other patients, the community he had deceived. All of it made his life unendurable. He resolved to confess, if only to leave behind an honest record of his sins. For hours his pen scratched across the pages, nearly 30 in all, a grim catalog of experiments, deaths, concealments, and his growing descent into madness. In painstaking detail, he described Thomas's final hours, the exhumation and the realization that his medical practice had been little more than a laboratory of horrors. By dawn, his confession stood as both testimony and self-indictment, a document that would one day become the most damning relic of Millbrook's darkest chapter. Frederick's confession painted a chilling portrait of deliberate selection and methodical cruelty. He admitted that his so-called treatments had targeted the most vulnerable patients with misunderstood conditions, desperate for relief, and often too isolated to draw suspicion if they died. Over time, he refined his methods, disguising drug-induced comas as natural deaths from heart failure, stroke, or complications of existing illnesses. Each case was supported by his medical credibility, his victims buried with little question. His journals revealed a meticulous record of experiments charting doses, effects, and outcomes with the cold precision of a scientist. Hidden behind a false panel in his study, alongside glass vials of preserved alkaloids, these notes formed a damning archive of his dissent. Most disturbing of all, Frederick confessed his growing suspicion that several of his patients had, like Thomas, awakened in their coffins. He recalled fingernail damage he had once dismissed as rigor mortis spasms, subtle shifts in body position, and tears in clothing that now seemed unmistakable signs of struggle. After finishing his confession, Frederick weighed his choices. Surrender meant a trial, disgrace, and likely execution. Worse, it meant forcing Millbrook's families to confront the horror that their loved ones had died, clawing for breath. Flight offered no absolution, but spared him the public reckoning. Before disappearing, he placed his confession journals and Thomas's daguerreotype inside a metal box, sealing it behind a false wall in the basement. Letters containing cryptic hints were sent to the Boston Medical Society and Reverend Hartwell, his last attempt to ensure that someday the truth would surface. On the night of June 15, 1861, Frederick left Millbrook under cover of darkness with a small satchel and enough money for a few weeks. He left only a brief note blaming his grief for Thomas's death and claiming he could no longer bear to practice medicine in town. His sudden departure fueled gossip. Some whispered of debts, others of secret affairs, still others of military service. The Elm Street house sat empty until it was seized for unpaid taxes and sold to a Boston family. It was during renovations of the basement that workers discovered the hidden laboratory and the sealed metal box. When opened, its contents stunned not only Millbrook, but the medical world. The 30-page confession, the detailed notes, the preserved compounds, and Thomas's haunting photograph were undeniable evidence of a systematic pattern of medical murder. Authorities exhumed several bodies from the town cemetery. At least 3 showed unmistakable signs of premature burial: broken nails, clawed wood, shredded fabric. Martha Henley's coffin bore the same desperate marks as Thomas's. The scandal rippled outward. Letters in Frederick's papers revealed that he had exchanged theories and findings with physicians across New England, some of whom had conducted experiments of their own. None had accumulated a death toll as high as Frederick's, but the revelations ruined reputations and careers. Even Dr. Samuel Hayes, whose innocent questions had accelerated Frederick's collapse, was tainted by association. In the aftermath, the Boston Medical Society overhauled its standards, implementing strict ethical codes for experimental treatments and oversight procedures that would shape American medicine for decades. Meanwhile, the hunt for Frederick Copeland became one of the largest manhunts in Massachusetts history. Local sheriffs, federal marshals, and Pinkerton detectives scoured the region following rumors of a tall, dark-eyed physician moving under false names. But Frederick had vanished as completely as if swallowed by the earth, leaving behind only his confession, his victims, and a legend of medicine's darkest betrayal. The manhunt for Frederick Copeland unfolded against the backdrop of the Civil War, a time when identities could be easily shed and assumed amid the constant churn of soldiers, doctors, and displaced civilians. His skills as a physician made him particularly difficult to track. While most fugitives were forced into labor or petty crime, Frederick could vanish into any community by presenting himself as a doctor. Records revealed he had emptied bank accounts and purchased equipment before fleeing Millbrook, suggesting his escape had been carefully planned. Investigators scoured Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, hoping to intercept him in familiar territory. But he left only faint traces. Reports soon stretched across the continent. Some claimed he was treating miners near Sacramento. Others that he had been spotted in a field hospital in Virginia. Each time the trail went cold, either through mistaken identity or Frederick's ability to slip away. What disturbed investigators most was the emergence of similar cases in remote towns. Vulnerable patients dying under the care of an itinerant physician whose description echoed Frederick's. The symptoms mirrored the Millbrook tragedies, patients with nervous disorders, epilepsy, or chronic pain dead, suddenly after experimental treatments. As the war consumed the nation's attention, resources for pursuing one fugitive dwindled. By 1865, the official search was effectively abandoned, though Frederick's name lingered on wanted lists and rewards for his capture remained unclaimed. His legend grew in whispered stories of a tall, dark-eyed doctor leaving death in his wake, moving from camp to camp, town to town. The most damning evidence surfaced in 1867 during renovations at a church in Springfield, Massachusetts. Hidden within the walls was a cache of papers left behind during Frederick's flight. These were not merely notes, they were a macabre archive. The documents included extensive correspondence with other physicians experimenting with alkaloids. But the most chilling discovery was a set of photographs. Unlike the single image of Thomas, these photographs showed multiple patients, some lying in apparent death. Others, visibly alive yet motionless, their bodies posed as though already prepared for burial. A few images revealed even worse individuals who had awakened during the process, eyes wide with terror clawing at shrouds or bedding. Accompanying the photographs were Frederick's detailed notes, methodically cataloging the effects of different plant compounds, dosage levels, and durations of induced comas. The collection made clear that what had occurred in Millbrook was only part of a larger and more deliberate campaign of experimentation. The Springfield discovery reignited investigations across New England. Cases once thought closed were reopened, coffins exhumed, and death certificates scrutinized. Evidence began linking Frederick's methods to deaths far beyond Millbrook. Even more unsettling was the realization that he had not acted alone. His letters revealed an active network of physicians in at least 6 states, men exchanging results theories and case studies. While none appeared to have gone as far as Frederick, their correspondence proved that the pursuit of medical breakthroughs had led many to skirt the boundaries of morality and legality. The Copeland case was no longer just the story of one doctor gone mad. It was the exposure of a secret current in American medicine, a reminder that desperation for cures could blur the line between healing and horror. The collapse of Frederick Copeland's world did not end with Millbrook. His disappearance seemed to coincide with the vanishing of other physicians who had been corresponding with him, suggesting that the exposure of the Millbrook murders had shaken the entire underground network of experimental medicine. For all the horror, Frederick's notes revealed a cruel irony. Some of his alkaloid mixtures had shown genuine promise for treating epilepsy and nervous disorders. In another man's hands, they might have led to breakthroughs. Instead, Frederick's obsession and disregard for human life transformed the pursuit of healing into a litany of suffering and death. The Copeland case reverberated through American society far beyond the tragedy of the murders themselves. The idea that a trusted doctor could systematically prey upon his patients shattered public faith in the profession. Medical schools across the country instituted new codes of ethics and mandatory training on research oversight reforms that endured for generations. The story became required reading for young doctors, a grim warning about the dangers of ambition without morality. For the people of Millbrook, the trauma was personal and enduring. Families began to fear the grave itself. Nightmares of premature burial spread through the town, and cremation, once condemned as unchristian, became an option. Some were willing to consider to avoid the fate Frederick's victims had endured. The once peaceful cemetery became a place of dread, its headstones whispered over as potential markers of the buried alive. Nationwide inventors capitalized on these fears, designing safety coffins equipped with bells, air pipes, or escape mechanisms to ensure no one would suffer the same fate. The murders quickly escaped the confines of Millbrook and entered popular culture. Newspapers published sensational retellings. Theater companies staged lurid productions, and pulp authors turned Frederick into a stock villain, representing the corruption of modern science. Preachers across New England thundered warnings that the case proved divine judgment against man's arrogance. Frederick became less a man than a symbol proof of what could happen when medical science strayed from compassion into unchecked ambition. Despite all the efforts to track him, Frederick himself was never captured. Rumors stretched across the continent. A tall, dark-eyed doctor turned up in Dakota Territory in 1871, tending settlers and soldiers before vanishing again. Some believed he perished on the frontier, claimed by disease or violence. Others argued he successfully reinvented himself, blending into the countless anonymous doctors scattered across a growing nation. More chilling still were reports that his experiments continued wherever he went. Deaths of vulnerable patients trailed him like shadows from New England to California. In 1869, a Colorado mining camp hosted a physician calling himself Francis Coleman. 3 patients died suddenly under his care, and he disappeared after the 3rd burial, leaving behind notes and plant specimens. In 1873, an Oregon farming community welcomed a doctor named Frederick Collins, whose remedies for epilepsy and nervous disorders resembled Copeland's work. When authorities came to investigate suspicious deaths, they found only an abandoned laboratory filled with exotic extracts and careful records. Frederick Copeland's trail dissolved into folklore. But the pattern suggested a disturbing truth that he may never have stopped. His crimes in Millbrook were not an ending, but the beginning of a wandering legacy of terror that stretched from coast to coast. In 1875, 14 years after Thomas Copeland's supposed death, the case took another horrifying turn when Samuel Morrison, the photographer who had taken Thomas's post-mortem portrait, broke his silence. Morrison revealed that during the long exposure needed for the daguerreotype, he had noticed something that unsettled him. Slight movements in Thomas's face and hands. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of light or natural shifts in the body, but what his trained eye really saw were faint signs of breathing and subtle muscle twitches. Morrison admitted that he had voiced his concerns to Frederick that very day, suggesting Thomas might not actually be dead. Frederick had brushed him off, explaining that such movements were common after death, the result of cooling and settling in the body. At the time, Morrison deferred to the doctor's authority, suppressing his doubts. But when Frederick's crimes came to light years later, Morrison realized the truth. He might have been the last person with a chance to save Thomas's life. This revelation changed everything. If Morrison could see signs of life, then Frederick, trained and vigilant, surely had as well. The case shifted from tragic negligence to deliberate murder, suggesting Frederick knowingly buried his brother alive to conceal the failure of his experiments. Even more disturbing, Morrison disclosed that he had taken post-mortem photographs of at least 3 other patients under Frederick's care and noticed the same subtle signs of life in each. What had seemed like odd details in the moment now appeared as evidence of systematic murder. The impact on Millbrook was devastating. Panic gripped the town as rumors spread that others might have shared Thomas's fate. Families demanded exhumations, and the cemetery became a place of dread and frantic activity. Fear of premature burial infected the community so deeply that many insisted on delaying burials for days, some for weeks, or demanded proof of death through increasingly elaborate procedures. Dr. William Brennan, who had inherited Frederick's practice, was overwhelmed not only by medical cases, but by terrified residents begging for reassurance. He introduced strict new protocols, extended observation periods, repeated examinations, and community witnesses before a body could be declared truly dead. Despite these measures, fear of being buried alive seeped into everyday life. Some townsfolk developed what we would now call panic disorders, convinced they might fall into a death-like trance and suffer Thomas's fate. Religious leaders like Reverend Hartwell tried to soothe their congregations with promises of God's mercy and order in creation. But sermons did little to quiet the nightmares. The Copeland tragedy had reshaped the town's relationship with death itself. Faith faltered, trust in medicine was broken, and even the grave no longer offered certainty. By the mid-1870s, the Copeland affair had grown far beyond Millbrook. What had begun as the exposure of one physician's horrific crimes evolved into a reckoning for the entire medical establishment. Sunday sermons no longer centered on salvation and eternal life. Instead, they wrestled with darker questions: why suffering persisted, how evil could flourish within trusted institutions, and why science, which promised progress, had betrayed the innocent. Medical journals dissected the case in painstaking detail, trying to unravel how a Harvard-trained physician could slip into such depravity. The Boston Medical Society, embarrassed by its earlier correspondence with Frederick, spearheaded a sweeping investigation of experimental practices across New England. What they uncovered was unsettling. Frederick had not been alone. Other respected doctors, while not guilty of murders on his scale, had also been experimenting recklessly on human subjects without consent or safeguards. The scandal forced change. Medical schools introduced formal ethics training. Professional societies drafted new codes of conduct and informed consent, a concept almost unheard of in the 19th century, began to take root. These reforms marked some of the earliest steps toward protecting patients from being treated as disposable test subjects. Yet the reforms were born out of horror reminders of how easily ambition could eclipse compassion. The debate spilled out of the medical halls and into society at large. Newspapers, pulp writers, and politicians questioned whether the pursuit of science had grown dangerously detached from morality. Could progress be trusted if it required such sacrifices? For religious leaders and critics of modern medicine, the Copeland case became proof of the dangers of unchecked curiosity. A cautionary tale that resonated with audiences far beyond New England. As news spread overseas, European authorities began combing through their own records. Letters found in Frederick's hidden archives revealed connections to physicians in London, Paris, and Vienna, all of whom had been conducting similar studies on alkaloids and nervous disorders. Some of these correspondents disappeared around the same time. Frederick fled, suggesting that his exposure had set off a wider collapse within this shadowy network of experimentalists. Investigations abroad uncovered disturbing parallels. In London, at least 2 patients treated with experimental alkaloids died under conditions eerily similar to the Millbrook victims. In Paris, authorities traced a research program that had left several epilepsy patients dead, their symptoms echoing those described in Frederick's notes. Vienna's medical circles too contained whispers of unexplained deaths linked to ambitious young researchers pushing the limits of plant-based compounds. What emerged was a grim realization. Frederick Copeland's crimes were not an isolated descent into madness, but part of a broader international pattern of unregulated experimentation that preyed on the desperate and vulnerable. His case had simply torn away, the veil exposing a hidden culture of medical ambition gone unchecked. By the late 19th century, Frederick Copeland had become less a man than a ghost story whispered in both medical halls and rural graveyards. Patients with epilepsy hysteria and what physicians then called neurasthenia conditions, misunderstood and deemed hopeless, had been the ones most often subjected to Frederick's experiments. They were desperate for relief, and their isolation made their sudden deaths unlikely to raise alarm. Then, in 1889, 28 years after Frederick's disappearance, a package arrived at the Boston Medical Society. It carried no return address, only a photograph and a note in handwriting verified as Frederick's. The daguerreotype depicted an elderly man laid out in a coffin, posed exactly as Thomas had been decades earlier. The gaunt face was aged by hardship, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Frederick Copeland. The note was short, chilling in its simplicity. The final subject of my research. May God have mercy on my soul, and may my victims find peace in death that they were denied in life. The experiments are complete. It was dated only winter 1889. Experts who examined the image noticed the same unsettling details that photographer Samuel Morison had once described in Thomas's portrait: faint indications of shallow breath, the suggestion of life clinging beneath the stillness. Alongside the photograph was a vial of crystalline powder and a set of notes detailing its composition. Analysis revealed a refined alkaloid compound, apparently perfected after decades of trial and error, capable of inducing a reversible death-like state. Frederick had achieved the breakthrough he sought, but only by sacrificing countless victims and perhaps himself. It seemed his last experiment had been to test the formula on his own body. The revelation cemented the Copeland case as one of the darkest chapters in American medicine. It forced the profession to confront uncomfortable truths that science pursued without compassion. Becomes cruelty that unchecked ambition can twist healers into monsters. Medical schools began teaching ethics not as philosophy, but as necessity. Professional organizations codified informed consent oversight and patient protections that still shape healthcare today. Millbrook never fully escaped the shadow of the crimes. Its cemetery, once a place of quiet mourning, became a destination for those fascinated by the macabre intersection of medicine and death. In 1901, the town erected a memorial to Frederick's victims, a somber reminder carved in stone that science without humanity leads only to horror. The story outlived its time, feeding the imagination of writers, journalists, and filmmakers. Gothic novels borrowed its themes of doctors who tamper with life and death. Early horror cinema lifted its imagery of clawed coffins, premature burials, and sinister laboratories. The Copeland case became less about one man's sins and more about a universal fear that progress can cost more than it gives. And yet, despite the archives, the photographs, and the memorial's mysteries linger. Was Frederick truly his own final subject? Or did he vanish once more under a new name, leaving behind a false ending? Were there other caches of notes, other graves that tell a story still hidden? The case reminds us that medicine must balance discovery with dignity, and that the lives entrusted to physicians can never be reduced to experiments.